The Colorado River is one of the most important rivers in the world, a slender ribbon of water winding through the deserts and canyons of the American Southwest, carrying the lifeblood of an entire region on its long journey toward the sea. Born high in the Rocky Mountains, gathering the meltwater of the winter snows, it flows through 7 states and across an international border, supplying the water for tens of millions of people, for millions of acres of the most productive farmland in the country, and for great cities that could never have risen in the desert without it. It is, without exaggeration, the river that built the modern Southwest, the thread on which an entire civilization hangs. But the Colorado River is shrinking. Diminished by a relentless drought and a warming climate, its flow declining, and its great reservoirs falling to levels once thought impossible, and the once unthinkable question now hangs over the region: what would happen if the river ran dry? If that day came, the consequences would be catastrophic, and there are cities across the Southwest that would face nothing short of disaster. This is the story of what could happen if the Colorado River ran dry, and of the 12 cities that would face the greatest catastrophe. Before we go further, one honest word about what this really means, because the scenario is stark and deserves care. To speak of the Colorado River running dry is to describe an extreme and, we must hope, avoidable outcome. Not a certainty, and not an event that would happen overnight. The river is unlikely to vanish completely, but it could fall so low that it can no longer meet the enormous demands placed upon it, that its great reservoirs reach the point where they can no longer reliably deliver water, and that the cities and farms that depend on it face severe and painful shortages. It is this functional running dry, the failure of the river to supply what the region has come to need, rather than a literal disappearance of every drop, that would bring disaster. Understanding what such a crisis would mean, and which cities would face the greatest danger, reveals just how much depends on this single river, and that understanding is what this video is here to provide. Real quick, before we go further, a lot of people watch these all the way to the end, genuinely enjoy them, and forget the one small thing that keeps a small channel like ours alive: hitting subscribe. It is honestly important right now. Our sub rate is low, and every single tap makes a real difference. So if you are finding this valuable, please subscribe right now. It takes 1 second and costs you nothing. And drop the name of your city in the comments so we can see who is watching. Alright, let's begin. Why the Colorado River is in danger. To understand the disaster that would follow if the Colorado River ran dry, we must first understand why the river is in danger, for its plight is the result of a fundamental imbalance that has been building for a century. The river was divided among the states and the 2 nations that share it by a series of agreements. The first and most important of which was made long ago, in an era when the river was measured during an unusually wet period and was thought to carry far more water than it actually does over the long run. From the very beginning then, the river was promised to its users in quantities greater than it could reliably provide, so that the demands placed upon it exceeded its true supply even in normal times. For decades, this fundamental overallocation was hidden by the great reservoirs built along the river, above all the 2 enormous stores that hold back its water, which captured the surplus of the wet years and used it to cover the deficits of the dry ones. As long as the reservoirs remained full, the gap between what was promised and what the river delivered went unnoticed. But over the past quarter century, a severe and persistent drought has gripped the region, one of the worst in centuries, and the warming climate has intensified it, shrinking the mountain snowpack that feeds the river, causing that snow to melt earlier and evaporate faster, drying the soil so that less water reaches the river, and evaporating more water directly from the surfaces of the reservoirs. The river has run well below its historical average year after year, and the great reservoirs have been drawn down toward levels that would cripple their ability to function. Meanwhile, the demand has remained high, driven by growing cities and vast farms, so that more water is taken from the river than it now provides. It is worth pausing to appreciate just how remarkable and how precarious the system built upon this river truly is. Over the past century, engineers transformed a wild and unpredictable desert river into one of the most controlled and heavily used waterways in the world, raising enormous dams across its canyons, holding back its water in vast reservoirs, and building an intricate web of canals and aqueducts to carry that water hundreds of miles over mountains and across deserts to the places where it was needed. On the strength of this engineering, cities that had been little more than dusty outposts swelled into sprawling metropolises of millions, and deserts that had known only sagebrush became among the most productive farmland on Earth. The entire edifice of modern life in the Southwest was built upon the assumption that the river would always deliver, and for generations it did, so reliably that most people forgot how thin and how precious the thread on which their world depended truly was. But that assumption was always, in part, an illusion, sustained by the temporary abundance of a wetter era and by the drawing down of the reservoirs. As the drought and the warming have revealed the true limits of the river, the precariousness that was always hidden within the system has been laid bare, and the possibility that the river could run dry, once dismissed as impossible, has become a scenario that serious people plan for. This is the imbalance that threatens to run the river dry, the collision between a shrinking supply and a demand that was always too large, and it is deepening with each passing year as the warming intensifies and the reservoirs fall. The first city, Las Vegas. Almost wholly dependent, we begin with Las Vegas, the dazzling desert metropolis that may be the single most Colorado-dependent major city in the entire basin, for it draws the overwhelming majority of its water from a great reservoir on the river, so that its very existence hangs on the river's flow. This glittering city rose improbably in one of the driest places in the country, and it leans almost entirely on the one reservoir, so that if the Colorado ran dry and that reservoir failed, the city would face a catastrophe of the first order, its primary source of water gone, and few alternatives to turn to in the surrounding desert. Las Vegas has done more than almost any other city to prepare for this danger, becoming a world leader in water conservation, tearing out thirsty grass, banning it in new developments, and recycling nearly all the water used indoors, so that it has reduced its total water use even as its population has grown substantially. It even built a new, deeper intake to keep drawing water from the reservoir should it fall to very low levels, a costly insurance against the worst. But all of this preparation, impressive as it is, cannot change the fundamental fact that the city draws nearly all its water from a single source on the Colorado, and if that river ran dry, no amount of conservation could conjure water that does not exist. There is a profound lesson in the case of Las Vegas, for it shows that even the most determined preparation cannot overcome a fundamental dependence on a single failing source. The city has done nearly everything that could be asked of it, achieving levels of water efficiency that other cities can only admire, and yet it remains. At bottom, a city that draws almost all of its water from one reservoir on one river, so that its fate is inseparable from the fate of that river. This is the paradox of Las Vegas, that its impressive conservation, while it has stretched its limited supply remarkably far, cannot change the basic arithmetic of near-total dependence on the Colorado. The lesson is a sobering one for the whole region, for it suggests that conservation, essential as it is not by itself a solution to the running dry of the river, but a way of enduring the scarcity rather than escaping it. Las Vegas would face disaster, its remarkable efficiency able only to delay and soften the blow, not to prevent it. For a city so utterly dependent on one shrinking river is only as secure as that river, and a dry Colorado would leave it desperately exposed. The second city, Phoenix. The sprawling giant, and the desert our second city, is Phoenix, the vast metropolis of the Arizona desert, one of the largest and fastest growing cities in the nation, which draws a large share of its water from the Colorado through an immense canal that carries the river across the desert, and which would face catastrophe if that river ran dry. Phoenix has grown into a sprawling giant in a place of extreme heat and almost no rain, its millions of residents dependent on water brought from afar. And its position in the sharing of the river is a particularly vulnerable one, for the water carried through its great canal holds a junior priority, placing the city among the very first to face cuts when the river runs short. If the Colorado ran dry, the water carried to Phoenix through that canal would be among the first to disappear, and the city would face a crisis of staggering proportions, for its enormous population and its intense heat make its need for water immense, and its alternatives are limited. Phoenix has prepared with unusual care, banking water underground in the wetter years and investing heavily in conservation, and it draws on other sources as well, from rivers within the state and from groundwater beneath the valley. But those other sources are themselves under strain and could not begin to replace the vast quantity of water the city draws from the Colorado. The scale of what is at stake in Phoenix is difficult to overstate, for the city and its surrounding metropolitan area have grown into one of the largest population centers in the entire country, home to millions of people who have made their lives in the desert on the strength of the imported water. The city continues to grow even now, adding new residents and new developments. In a place where the summer heat can be among the most extreme recorded anywhere, and where the natural water is nowhere near enough to sustain such a population. This combination of enormous size, relentless growth, extreme heat, and near total dependence on imported water from a shrinking river creates a vulnerability of staggering proportions. For a city so large and so hot cannot easily reduce its need for water, and a dry Colorado would remove the foundation on which its existence rests. The junior priority of its river water only sharpens the danger, placing it at the front of the line for cuts, so that Phoenix would feel the running dry of the river sooner and more severely than almost any other major city. A dry river would leave Phoenix, a giant built on the assumption of abundant imported water, facing the terrible reality of a supply that had failed, and the sprawling desert metropolis would confront a disaster from which even its careful preparation could not fully save it. Quick question I would genuinely love your take on, and it takes 10 seconds. Did you know that a single river supplies water to 7 states and tens of millions of people across the Southwest? Drop a yes or a no in the comments, because your answers help me understand what surprises people most, and I read every single reply. Okay, back to the cities. The third city, Tucson. Junior and exposed our third city is Tucson, the desert city of southern Arizona, which draws much of its water from the Colorado through the same immense canal that supplies Phoenix, and which holds an even more junior priority, placing it at the very front of the line for cuts when the river runs short. This means that if the Colorado ran dry, Tucson's river water would be among the first of all to disappear, its junior standing leaving it acutely exposed to the failure of the river. Yet Tucson has been remarkably foresighted about its vulnerable position, and its story offers a measure of hope amid the danger. For many years, rather than using all of its river water directly, the city has taken much of it and stored it underground, recharging the aquifer beneath the city and banking a substantial reserve against the day when its river deliveries are cut. This banked water, combined with the city's strong conservation and its careful management, gives it a cushion that its junior position would not otherwise suggest, a store of water that could help carry it through even a severe reduction in its river supply. If the Colorado ran dry and Tucson's river water was cut, this banked reserve would be its lifeline, allowing it to endure the loss far better than most cities could. Tucson thus illustrates both the peril of holding a junior claim to a dying river and the wisdom of preparing for the worst in advance, and though it would be among the first to lose its river water, it has given itself a better chance than most of surviving the disaster. The fourth city, Los Angeles, reaching across the desert. Our fourth city is Los Angeles, the vast metropolis of Southern California, which reaches out across enormous distances to bring in the water it needs, drawing a significant share of its supply from the Colorado through a long aqueduct that carries the river's water across the desert to the coast. Though Los Angeles has other sources as well. From the mountains to the east, and from the north of the state, its share of the Colorado is an important part of its supply, and the running dry of the river would threaten that portion of its water and deepen the strain on all the rest. Los Angeles holds a relatively senior priority in the sharing of the river, which would offer it some protection, for the most senior users are cut last. But even a senior user could not fully escape the catastrophe of a river run dry, and the loss of its Colorado water would strike a city whose demands are enormous, and whose other sources are themselves under pressure from drought and the shrinking snowpack. The city has invested heavily in conservation, recycling, and the capture of stormwater, and it is working to reduce its reliance on the distant river, but the running dry of the Colorado would still be a grave blow, forcing the great coastal metropolis to lean ever harder on sources that are themselves stretched thin. Los Angeles reminds us that even a great and resourceful city far from the river is bound to its fate, and that the disaster of a dry Colorado would reach all the way to the Pacific coast. Quick pause, because this part matters and it deserves to be seen by more people. If you are getting real value from this, tap the like button. It genuinely helps the video reach others who care about where their water comes from. And if you have family or friends anywhere in the Southwest, share this with them, because it honestly matters that the people who depend on this water understand what is happening to it. One like, one share to someone in your family, and let's keep going. The fifth city, San Diego. The most import-dependent, our fifth city, is San Diego, the great coastal city of Southern California that has depended even more heavily than Los Angeles on imported water, including a large share from the Colorado, and that would feel the running dry of the river keenly. San Diego sits in a dry region with little local water, and it has long relied on water brought from afar, so that the health of the Colorado matters greatly to its security. And a dry river would strike at a vital part of its supply. San Diego learned the danger of its dependence during an earlier drought, when its imported water was threatened and the city came uncomfortably close to a crisis, an experience that spurred it to invest heavily in securing and diversifying its supply. It turned to the ocean, building the capacity to remove salt from seawater, and it secured more reliable arrangements for the water it imports, so that it is better prepared today than it once was. This foresight would serve it well in the disaster of a dry Colorado, giving it more resilience than many other cities. But the fundamental fact remains that San Diego depends heavily on imported water, and a significant portion comes from the Colorado, so that the running dry of the river would force it to lean even harder on its other sources and its desalination, and would still represent a serious blow to a city built in a dry land far from any abundant supply of its own. San Diego's turn to the sea is especially significant, for it represents a fundamentally new kind of water source, one that does not depend on the rain, the snow, or the level of a distant reservoir, but on the ocean itself, which is effectively limitless. The removal of salt from seawater is expensive and demands a great deal of energy, and it cannot by itself supply all of a great city's needs. But it offers a drought-proof source that provides a genuine hedge against the failure of the imported water on which the city once leaned so heavily. In the disaster of a dry Colorado, this ability to draw water from the sea would be one of San Diego's greatest assets, a source that would keep flowing even as the river failed. And it stands as a model for how other coastal cities might reduce their vulnerability. Yet desalination alone cannot make a desert city fully secure, and San Diego would still feel the running dry of the river keenly, a reminder that even the most forward-thinking preparation cannot wholly escape the consequences of so vast a crisis. The sixth city, Denver, drinking from the headwaters, our sixth city, takes us to the other side of the Great Mountains, to Denver, the largest city of the Rocky Mountain region, which draws a significant share of its water from the headwaters of the Colorado, carried across the mountains through a system of diversions from the wetter western slopes to the drier, more populous eastern side where the city lies. Though Denver sits far from the parched lower reaches of the river and in the upper region where the water begins, it is nonetheless bound to the health of the whole system, for the water it diverts comes from the same river, and the pressures that threaten the Colorado threaten the headwaters as well. The running dry of the Colorado would be, above all, a sign of a system in profound crisis, and in such a crisis, the upper region, including Denver, could face pressure of its own. The great agreements that divide the river oblige the upper region to deliver a certain amount of water downstream, and if the river ran so low that it approached running dry, the upper region could be forced to curtail its own use to meet that obligation, a scenario that would fall hardest on the more recently developed water users. Denver, drawing its water from the headwaters through diversions, could find itself caught up in such a curtailment, and the same drought and warming that would run the river dry would also shrink the snowpack that feeds the city's supply directly. Denver thus illustrates that even the region where the water begins is not safe from the disaster of a dry Colorado, and that the crisis would reach from the river's mouth all the way back to its mountain source. The seventh city, Albuquerque, on a distant branch, our seventh city, is Albuquerque, the largest city of New Mexico, which draws a portion of its water from the Colorado system through a diversion that carries water across the mountains from a tributary of the Great River into the basin where the city lies. This diverted water has become an important part of the city's supply, and because it comes from the same Colorado system, the city is bound to the health of the whole and would feel the effects of the river running dry. Albuquerque's history offers a cautionary tale, for it once believed it sat atop an inexhaustible supply of groundwater and pumped freely from the aquifer beneath it, only to discover that the underground water was being drawn down toward exhaustion. The city wisely changed its ways, working to reduce its reliance on the aquifer and to lean more heavily on the surface water diverted from the Colorado system. But this surface water, drawn from a tributary of the Great River, holds a junior standing and is subject to the same drought and warming that threaten the Colorado, so that in the disaster of a dry river, this diverted water could be curtailed, throwing the city back upon its recovering aquifer. If the Colorado ran dry and the whole system was thrown into crisis, Albuquerque would feel the pressure, its diverted surface water threatened, and its groundwater its only fallback. A reminder that the reach of the Colorado extends even across the mountains into basins far from its main channel. All right, I know, this is the second time I am bringing this up. You can roll your eyes at me. But honestly, if you have made it this deep into a video about the Colorado River, you clearly care about this stuff, and a lot of you watching still have not subscribed. I am not going to make you feel bad about it, but that one tap genuinely tips the scales for a small channel fighting a low subrate. It really does matter to us. That is the last time I will ask. Promise. Let's finish. The eighth city, Santa Fe, sharing the distant source our eighth city is Santa Fe, another city of New Mexico, which shares in the same diversion of water from a tributary of the Colorado system that supplies its larger neighbor, carrying water across the mountains to help meet the needs of the city. This diverted water is a valuable part of Santa Fe's supply, supplementing its other sources, and it ties the city to the health of the Colorado system and to the fate of the Great River. Santa Fe has long been a place that understood the value of water, situated as it is in a dry region where the resource has always been precious, and it has worked to use its water wisely and to secure a diverse supply, drawing on the rivers near it, on the groundwater beneath it, and on the water carried across the mountains from the Colorado system. This diversity of sources gives the city more resilience than a place dependent on a single supply. But its share of the water diverted from the Colorado would be threatened by the running dry of the river, for that water is drawn from a tributary of the Great River and holds a junior standing, subject to curtailment in the crisis that a dry Colorado would bring. If the river ran dry and the shortage deepened across the whole system, Santa Fe's portion of the diverted water could be reduced, forcing it to lean harder on its other sources and its conservation, and though it has other supplies to fall back upon, this city stands among those that would feel the disaster of a dry Colorado. The ninth city, Salt Lake City, tied to the wider crisis our ninth city, is Salt Lake City, the largest city of Utah, which lies in the upper region of the Colorado system, and which, though it draws much of its water from the snows of its own nearby mountains, is bound to the wider crisis of the Great River and to the water challenges that a dry Colorado would represent. Utah is one of the states that share the Colorado, and its growth and its water use are tied up with the management of the whole system, so that the running dry of the river would reverberate through the state and its capital. Salt Lake City depends heavily on the snowpack of the mountains around it, which feeds the reservoirs that supply the city, and this snowpack is being diminished by the same warming climate that threatens the Colorado, so that the city's water is under pressure from the same underlying forces. The city has grown rapidly, adding to the demand on its water even as the supply grows less reliable. And it sits beside a great shrinking lake, whose decline has become a symbol of the region's water crisis, threatening dust as well as shortage. As one of the 7 states that share the Colorado, Utah would be caught up in the crisis of a dry river, forced to grapple with curtailment and conflict over the shrinking supply, and Salt Lake City, its largest city, would feel the strain. There is an important truth in Salt Lake City's situation, that the crisis of the Colorado is not only a matter of physical water deliveries, but of the legal and political bonds that tie the 7 states together. Even a city that draws most of its water from its own local mountains is bound to the fate of the Colorado through its state's membership in the compact that governs the river. and through the shared obligations and negotiations that determine how the whole system is managed. A crisis severe enough to run the river dry would throw those arrangements into turmoil, forcing every state, including Utah, to confront painful questions about how the shrinking water should be divided and how much each must give up. In this way, the disaster would reach even those cities whose taps are fed by other sources, drawing them into the conflict and the reckoning that a dry river would bring. The city thus illustrates that the disaster of a dry Colorado would extend beyond those who drink directly from the river to encompass the whole community of states and cities bound together by their shared dependence on the great river system. The 10th city, St. George, the fast-growing newcomer, our 10th city, is St. George, a fast-growing city in the desert of southern Utah, in the upper region of the Colorado system, which has become one of the fastest-growing communities in the nation, even as it sits in one of the driest and most water-stressed corners of the country. St. George draws its water from a tributary of the Colorado system and from the groundwater beneath it, and its explosive growth has placed enormous pressure on its limited supply, so that it has looked, at times, toward the possibility of drawing water from the great river itself to sustain its expansion. The running dry of the Colorado would strike at St. George in several ways. It would foreclose the possibility of drawing new water from the river, a hope that some had entertained as a solution to the city's growing thirst. It would signal a crisis across the whole system that could bring curtailment to the upper region of which the city is a part, threatening its existing supply. And it would come at a time when the city's rapid growth has already stretched its water to the limit, so that even a modest reduction could be deeply felt. This fast-growing newcomer, dependent on a tributary and on groundwater in a water-stressed land, illustrates the peril of building rapidly where the water is scarce, and it stands among the cities that would face disaster if the Colorado ran dry, its ambitions for growth colliding with the harsh reality of a shrinking supply. The 11th city, Cheyenne, drawing from the mountains our 11th city, is Cheyenne. The largest city of Wyoming, one of the states of the upper region of the Colorado system, which draws a portion of its water from the headwaters of the Great River through diversions that carry water across the divide from the western slopes to the city on the drier eastern side. Though Cheyenne lies far from the parched lower reaches of the Colorado and draws only a portion of its water from the system, it is nonetheless one of the cities bound to the river's fate, its supply tied to the same mountain snows that feed the Great River. The running dry of the Colorado would reach Cheyenne through the crisis it would bring to the whole upper region. As one of the states obligated to deliver water downstream, Wyoming could face curtailment of its own newer water users if the river ran so low that its delivery obligations could not be met alongside its own use, and the diversions that supply Cheyenne. Drawing junior water from the headwaters could be caught up in such a curtailment, and the same warming that would run the river dry would shrink the snowpack that feeds the city's diversions directly, threatening its supply at the source. Cheyenne thus illustrates once more that the disaster of a dry Colorado would reach even into the far northern reaches of the system, touching a city in a state that most people would never associate with the water crisis of the desert Southwest, and reminding us of the vast extent of the river's reach. The inclusion of a northern city like Cheyenne among those threatened by a dry Colorado underscores a point that runs through this entire story, that the river binds together an enormous and diverse territory, from the high plains of Wyoming to the deserts of the border, and that a crisis at the heart of the system would send its effects rippling to the farthest edges. No part of the vast basin is entirely insulated from the fate of the river, and the interconnection that made the great cities and farms possible in the good times becomes a shared vulnerability in the bad. The 12th city, Yuma, where the river nears its end, our 12th and final city, is Yuma, the desert city near where the Colorado approaches the end of its long journey, in a region of intense heat and almost no rain, that has become one of the most productive agricultural areas in the country precisely because of the river's water. Yuma sits in a place where the Colorado, having traveled through the canyons and past the great cities and farms upstream, nears its final stretch, and the city and the vast farms around it depend on the river almost completely, drawing directly from its waters to sustain both the people and the agriculture that defines the region. The running dry of the Colorado would be catastrophic for Yuma. for the city and its surrounding farmland have little to fall back upon in the surrounding desert, and their dependence on the river is nearly total. The agriculture of the region, which produces a remarkable share of the nation's winter vegetables, relies entirely on the river's water carried through an intricate system of canals. And if the river ran dry, that agriculture could collapse, with grave consequences not only for the local economy, but for the food supply of the whole country. The city itself, drawing its water from the river, would face a crisis of the most fundamental kind. There is a special significance to Yuma's place in this story, for it sits at the far end of the river, downstream of nearly everyone else. And this position carries a particular vulnerability. In the harsh logic of a river shared among many, those nearest the end can be the most exposed, for by the time the water has traveled the length of the river, passing the diversions and the demands of all the users upstream, there may be little left to reach them, especially in the driest years. Yuma and its farms hold senior rights that offer them real protection, a legacy of having put the water to use very early, but even senior rights cannot deliver water that never arrives, and a river run dry would test the value of any claim. However old, the agriculture around Yuma is not a minor matter, for it feeds a large share of the nation during the winter months, growing the fresh vegetables that fill markets across the country when little else can be grown, so that the collapse of this farming would be felt far beyond the region, on tables thousands of miles away. Yuma, sitting where the river nears its end and depending on it almost completely, would be among the cities that would face the most complete and devastating disaster if the Colorado ran dry. A place where the failure of the river would strike at the very foundation of life and livelihood. What a dry Colorado would mean for the region. Having seen the 12 cities that would face disaster if the Colorado ran dry, from the great desert metropolises to the coastal cities, from the mountain headwaters to the river's distant end, we can step back and consider what a dry Colorado would mean for the region as a whole, for the disaster would reach far beyond any single city. The Colorado supplies water not only to cities, but to millions of acres of farmland, some of the most productive in the country, and the running dry of the river would devastate this agriculture, collapsing the production of a large share of the nation's vegetables and other crops, with consequences that would ripple through the food supply and the economy of the entire country. The failure of the river would also strike at the electricity generated at its dams, removing a major source of power from the grid and straining the energy supply across a wide region. The running dry of the river would also unleash conflict on a scale the region has never seen, as the states and the users, deprived of the water they had come to depend on, fought over the little that remained. In the courts and in the halls of power, in a struggle whose bitterness is difficult to imagine. The great agreements that have governed the river for a century would be pushed to the breaking point, and the careful cooperation that has so far kept the peace would be tested as never before, and the human toll would be immense. For the tens of millions of people who depend on the river would face shortages, restrictions, rising costs, and, in the worst case, the failure of the water on which their daily lives depend, a catastrophe that would reshape the region and force a reckoning with the limits of a land that was never meant to support so many. It is worth dwelling on the scale of the human consequences, for behind the abstractions of water rights and reservoir levels lie the lives of tens of millions of ordinary people. A dry Colorado would mean farmers watching their fields turn to dust and their livelihoods vanish, families facing sharp restrictions on the water they use for drinking, cooking, and bathing, businesses closing as the water that sustained them disappeared, and communities forced to confront whether they could remain in places that could no longer support them. The cost of water would soar as the supply failed, falling hardest on those least able to afford it, and the competition for what remained would strain the bonds that hold communities and states together. There would be winners and losers, for the harsh rules of water rights would protect some while devastating others, and the resulting inequities would breed resentment and conflict. The psychological toll would be immense as well, as people who had built their lives on the assumption of abundant water confronted the collapse of that assumption, and as a whole region grappled with the possibility that its way of life could no longer be sustained. A dry Colorado would not be a local disaster, but a regional and even national one striking at the water, the food, the power, and the stability of an entire quarter of the country. Can the disaster be prevented faced with so grave a scenario? The question naturally arises of whether the disaster can be prevented, and while the danger is real and growing, the answer is not one of despair. For a dry Colorado is not yet inevitable, and a great deal can still be done to pull the river back from the brink. The running dry of the river would follow from the imbalance between the water flowing into it and the water drawn out. And that imbalance can be addressed, though only through difficult and sustained effort. The single most important step is bringing the demand for the river's water into balance with what the river can actually provide, and because agriculture uses by far the largest share, this means significant changes in farming, in which crops are grown, how efficiently the water is used, and how much land is irrigated, changes that carry real costs, but that hold the greatest potential to close the gap. Alongside this, the cities can conserve, as many of them already have, wringing more use out of every drop through efficiency, recycling, and the reshaping of the thirsty landscapes of the past. New sources can be developed that do not draw on the failing river, from the recycling of wastewater to the removal of salt from seawater and brackish groundwater. The great reservoirs can be managed cooperatively, with the states and the users agreeing to share the reductions and to keep the reservoirs from falling to the critical levels, rather than draining them in a scramble each for their own. And the difficult negotiations over the future of the river, tense and contentious as they are, can produce agreements that share the shrinking water more wisely and more fairly, softening the harshness of the crisis. There is reason for cautious hope in the history of the river itself, for the states that share the Colorado have, time and again, managed to reach agreements at the brink, when the alternative of an uncontrolled collapse was too terrible to accept. The negotiations have often been bitter and the compromises painful, but the parties have repeatedly found ways to share the shrinking water rather than fight over it to mutual ruin, and this history offers some grounds for believing that they can do so again, even as the crisis deepens. The great desert cities, too, have shown what is possible, transforming themselves from symbols of profligate water use into models of efficiency, and proving that a society can learn to do far more with less water when it must. These examples do not guarantee that the disaster will be averted, for the challenge grows harder as the river shrinks, but they demonstrate that the tools to prevent it exist, and that the outcome depends not on fate, but on the choices people make. None of this is easy, and all of it demands foresight, sacrifice, and cooperation on a scale that is hard to achieve. But the alternative, the running dry of the river and the disaster it would bring, is so terrible that it provides the strongest possible reason to act. What the 12 cities are telling us, having traveled across the vast reach of the Colorado, from Las Vegas and Phoenix and Tucson in the heart of the desert, to Los Angeles and San Diego on the distant coast, to Denver and Cheyenne at the mountain headwaters, to Albuquerque and Santa Fe across the mountains, to Salt Lake City and St. George in the upper region, and to Yuma where the river nears its end, we can step back and consider what these 12 cities are telling us together. The first lesson is the astonishing reach of a single river, for a dry Colorado would threaten cities across all 7 of the states that share it and beyond, some drawing directly from the river, others connected through long aqueducts and cross-mountain diversions, and still others bound by the great agreements that divide the water. That so many cities, spread across so vast an area, could face disaster from the failure of one river reveals how deeply the Southwest depends on the Colorado and how much hangs on its survival. The second lesson is that this dependence, built up over a century of growth and engineering, has created a profound vulnerability, for the region has come to rely on a river that can no longer reliably provide what it has promised, and the running dry of that river, once unthinkable, has become a scenario serious enough to plan for and to fear. The cities have built their futures on the assumption of abundant water from the Colorado, and that assumption is now in question, leaving them exposed to a disaster that would strike at the very foundation of their existence. This vulnerability is a warning, a reminder that a civilization built on a single overtaxed river stands on uncertain ground. Yet the third lesson is one of hope as much as warning, for the disaster of a dry Colorado is not inevitable, and the cities that would face it are not passive victims awaiting their fate. Many of them have already taken remarkable steps to prepare, banking water underground, conserving fiercely, turning to the sea, and diversifying their supplies. And their efforts show that even in the face of so grave a threat, much can be done to build resilience and to soften the blow. The threat to the Colorado is a call to action, a reminder that the fate of the river and of the cities that depend on it is not yet sealed, and that the choices made in the years ahead will determine whether the river can be pulled back from the brink or whether it will be allowed to run dry. What happens will depend on whether the states and the users can come together to share the shrinking water and to bring their demand into balance with the river's diminished flow, and on whether the cities can continue to build the resilience that would help them endure. The Colorado River is in danger, and the 12 cities that depend on it are watching anxiously. But the story is not yet written, and the same determination that harnessed this great river and built a civilization in the desert can yet be turned to the task of saving them both. The river's fate hangs in the balance, and with it the future of 12 cities and the tens of millions of people who depend on the ribbon of water winding through the canyons of the Southwest. A river too important to lose, and a crisis far too serious to ignore. The people of the Southwest, and indeed of the whole country, have a profound stake in the survival of the Colorado, for it is not merely a regional resource, but a national treasure, feeding the country, powering its homes, and sustaining its greatest cities. To let it run dry would be to allow one of the worst self-inflicted disasters in the country's history, and to save it will require a level of wisdom, cooperation, and sacrifice that will test the region and the country as never before. But the effort is worth making, for the alternative is a catastrophe